The Dogman-Headed Sasquatch. Habituation. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I have a problem, or maybe I should say my family has a problem. In these times when it has become increasingly difficult for a regular guy to buy a house, my wife and I purchased a beautiful former ranch to move into just as my wife found out that she is expecting our first child. We thought we were the luckiest people in the world until we discovered our property is already habituated by at least one huge, hulking, 9-foot tall, hairy, dog-headed monster. I'm going to tell you about what we've been going through, and then I'm hoping someone in your audience will be able to give us advice as to how to get this creature to leave and move on somewhere else. We don't want to antagonize it, but we do want it to move far away. Our dream turned quickly into a nightmare when literally hours after the paperwork was finished and we officially owned this lovely house and property, I got chased down the road by our resident behemoth. One of my cousins thinks this is all funny, and he calls the monster Sparky. But there's absolutely no humor in this situation for my family. I asked this cousin if he wanted to trade houses with us, and he shut right up. I don't know that this creature isn't violent toward people. I know he's a predator and eats meat, so why should I rule out his coming after me or my pregnant wife? We were gonna get a cat and a dog, but that's out of the question while this beast views our land as his turf. I took a walk that night after we signed the paperwork and we owned our first home. I wanted to experience the area and really let it sink in that I was a homeowner in a beautiful area in Northern California that I won't mention specifically. The next neighbor is quite a ways away, and I was enjoying my stroll down a country lane, heading nowhere in particular. We got so much land so cheaply, and then there's surrounding land nobody's using on top of that, so it's almost like we have our own little state. I can't tell you how ecstatic and grateful I was feeling. That happiness ended in 1 second as, without any warning whatsoever, a huge brown dog head popped out from behind a tree at a height well over my head. It was snarling and growling, and I wondered if it was a mad dog. After all, why would a dog be hiding up in a tree as though it were a cat? Dogs don't hunt that way. As large as that canine head was, I still was imagining a dog body connected to that nasty-looking, angry head. The lips were curled back, revealing teeth that were inches long on both top and bottom. I tried to remember what to do in this kind of situation. Do I run? Do I back away slowly? While I was thinking, the dog barked at me loudly once, and I kind of lost my temper. This was my town, damn it. I was the homeowner, and this dog was not. So I looked that dog right in the eye, and I spoke to it in what I thought was a calming manner. I was foolishly acting like this was my pet dog, and he just needed to be calmed down so that he could remember his place on the food chain. Well, if you are ever confronted by a big dog head several feet taller than you, don't do what I did. It turns out, predators don't like to be looked in the eye. They take it as a challenge. You might as well go up and slap them with a glove, because by staring back at them, you're essentially challenging them to a duel. Angered and annoyed by my behavior, that dog thing took a step out from behind the tree. It was not a dog up on a tree branch, by the way. Its body extended from that big dog head way up 3 or 4 feet above me, all the way down to the ground. It was not a 4-legged beast as I had been envisioning in my mind. It was a 2-legged, man-like or almost bear-like being with a dog head. Its feet were humanoid feet, not canine. It had hands, not paws. In short, This was an 8 or 9 foot tall Sasquatch, but it had an immense brown wolf-like head. I had always said I believed in Bigfoot, but I guess I never really thought that I would see one in real life, and I kinda went into a bit of shock, losing my mind completely. I turned, and I ran, which is just as bad as looking the creature in the eye. When you run, you're telling that predator that you consider yourself its prey. It has an instinct to chase prey, and so you're basically asking to be hunted down when you do that. My heart was beating so fast that I thought I would die from that alone. I tried to run, but I kept tripping and getting up again. When I would look behind me, the dog-headed Sasquatch would be about the same distance away each time. And when it would see me looking back at it, then it would growl or bark or do something frightening to get me up and running all over again. It was toying with me. It was showing me who was boss. I made it home only because it allowed me to, and then it stood in front of our house and barked at us like a mother scolding bad children. My wife came to the front to see what it was, and I watched her knees collapse underneath her. Unlike me, my wife never even believed in the possibility of Bigfoot, and now she had to accept that even stranger things than Sasquatch can and do exist in those hills of Northern California. Believe it or not, that was the first time my wife saw me cry. I collapsed into her arms and she pushed me away. She didn't want to be my mother. She wanted to be my wife. She was relying on me to protect her. She hadn't signed on for coddling an adult toddler. So, first the dog-headed Bigfoot humiliated me, then my wife did the same. This was all my own fault, because I allowed my ego to become inflated when I bought that ranch earlier in the day. God does not want me to become full of myself, and so he sends me these little presents to remind me that I need to remain humble. We kind of both woke up the next morning feeling somewhat better. That experience had been startling and upsetting, but how many people see a cryptid 2 times in one lifetime? Almost none. We figured we had a bad day, but chances were that the creature would never rear its canine head in our presence again, even if we lived out there for another 75 years. Well, that was wrong. That very night, I was taking out some garbage that had been left in the attic by the previous owner when I rounded a corner, and there it was, standing by the garbage as though it were waiting for me. I was standing close enough that I could smell its strong, dog-like odor, maybe 10 or 11 feet away max. Even though I should have been mentally prepared for this, I was not. I was so certain in my belief that I would never see that monster again, that I had no plan for what to do if I saw it again. I tried to remain calm, though, and I gently put the garbage down right where I was. Then, keeping my eyes averted from its canine eyes, listening to it growling, incense around, literally vibrating the dirt under my feet, I took one slow, calm, tentative step backward. The beast lunged forward as though saying boo, and I screamed like a soprano, running back inside while looking over my shoulder. The giant beast made a sound almost like it was mocking me or laughing. It sounded more like a chimp than a dog in that moment, and once again, I had been defeated by this thing that seemed to be declaring ownership over our ranch. Dog-headed Bigfoot 2, me 0. When I got back inside, my wife asked me what was wrong, but I wouldn't tell her. She wanted me to be the protector of her and our unborn child, so I was going to have to man up. I wasn't going to whine to her about it, and I didn't want her to stress out about it either. That was probably a stupid decision on my part, but I was already 0 for 3. I didn't want to go 0 for 4. I really emotionally needed her on my side right then, so instead of telling her what had just happened, I changed the subject and asked her what was new on the streaming services we subscribed to. Our cable wasn't going to be installed for a while, but we had Wi-Fi, so I thought we should watch a movie. We picked out a comedy, and after about an hour, I was starting to feel human again. I was still a little jumpy, thinking I was seeing monsters every time the wind blew a tree outside one of the windows, but I was focusing on breathing deeply and watching the movie. I needed to get a good night of sleep that night because I had a lot of stuff to do the following day. My wife went to the kitchen to get herself a snack and I heard a crash and a scream. When I ran to her, I discovered that she had dropped and shattered a ceramic bowl, and she was staring out the kitchen window at the dog-headed behemoth. Its eyes were level with ours, even though his feet were a good 3 or 4 feet below where we were standing. He did his by now trademark move of lunging forward to scare us, and he banged the sides of both fists into the wooden window frames, cracking the wood on our side. If he had hit the glass, he'd have had his hands inside our home already, but he chose deliberately to hit and break the wood. Some frames of glass in the window had lightning-shaped cracks in them, while some others were still intact. It was an act of controlled aggression on his part, and I knew that was just a warning. My wife told me that we were going to go stay with her mother, and we both ran into the garage, which is attached to the house. I used the remote to open the garage door, and thankfully, there was no Dogman Sasquatch monster blocking our way. Hitting the gas, we peeled rubber flying out of that garage, and when we hit the gravel road in front of the place, I could see that hairy giant trotting toward us. I drove the car as fast as I could under the circumstances, knowing that we would not hit a paved road for about another minute of driving. The dog-headed Bigfoot trotted after us, occasionally slapping the back of our car just to show that he could easily keep up with us. The faster I drove, the faster he ran on his giant Bigfoot feet. It was clear that he didn't want to do us in that night. He just wanted to let us know that he could end our lives any time he felt like. He wanted us to understand that we were no longer on top of the food chain. Well, that was 2 months ago, and my wife has not come back to the house since then. I've been out there during the day, but only sunlit days. I keep thinking about staying overnight. After all, the monster might be gone by now. But as darkness approaches each time, I chicken out and I drive back to my mother-in-law's place. I went from feeling lucky and free, from experiencing the thrill of owning my own beautiful home in the country, to experiencing the agony of living with my mother-in-law and taking abuse from her husband, and from my pregnant wife as well. They insist that they don't blame me for this happening, but they do blame me for not solving the problem. I've been reading as much as I can lately about both Dogman and Sasquatch, but the more I read or hear, the more complicated I realize the subject is. I understand now that this is called a habituation. The creature sees your home as its home, and it can easily turn into a deadly situation at the drop of a hat. I have yet to see any really solid ideas on how to get the monster to go away except for one: using trail cams. People say that both the Dogman and the Sasquatch know what a trail cam is, and so they avoid them like the plague. Some people go as far as to say that putting trail cams up around your property will get the creatures to move out of your neighborhood. I've ordered a bunch of them from online, and when they arrive, I'm going to go back to the house on a bright sunny day, and I'm going to put the cameras up in every place on the property that I would like to be able to walk around in without fear. Then, I'm going to go back once a week and check to see if we caught anything on those cameras. I figure maybe we'll get footage of this dog-headed Bigfoot. Or maybe we'll chase it away. My wife says that this is a dumb idea, as the only result will likely be that we'll get footage of the monster stomping me out of existence. So, I need a plan B. What else can I do to shoo the monster away without getting it angry all over again? How can we make our property less desirable for the thing? I don't really know why it wants to be here, so I don't really know how to make it want to go away either. If anyone who can hear this has any experience in this area, I beg you to please share your knowledge in the comments section. Or even if you just have a good idea that we haven't tried yet, we'd love to hear it, or at least I would. We'll never be able to get another home like this one, even at 3 times the price. If we lose this place, we're going to have to go back to renting if we can even afford that. So as you can see, the entire future of my family depends on me finding a solution to the problem of the dog-headed Sasquatch habituation. The Ball of Light and the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have an odd Dogman story for you. It was the scariest and weirdest, most inexplicable thing that ever happened to me. I'm not a great storyteller, so please feel free to fix this if you can. I get shivers whenever I think about any of this, yet I can tell the story to others, and they say, "That doesn't sound so scary." Trust me, this was terrifying, and I still can't explain what happened. Just the idea of this story freaks me completely out. That something like this could even occur proves that I don't understand how reality functions. I was camping with my first serious girlfriend when I was 22 years old. She and I were talking about marriage, and she was the first woman I lived with. This was back in the 80s, and my mom called it living in sin, but most people did this before getting married. So camping was another way to test our relationship and see if we might be meant to marry each other or not. Skeptics tell me that we brought this situation on ourselves because we were telling scary stories to each other around the campfire. I would tell a ghost or a campfire story, and she would try to tell one scarier than the one I had told. And then, of course, I would top her and so on. Sitting alone in a clearing in the woods around our fire pit, I have to say we both succeeded in scaring the living daylights out of each other. When my girlfriend, let's call her Pat, told me she was seeing an eerie light floating around in the woods, I told her to shut up. I thought she was trying to scare me to death, but it turned out that when I looked where she was pointing, I could see it too. It was not a man with a flashlight, because the light kept changing color and changing shape. For some reason, we both thought it was a UFO. Now, back then, there were some stories about UFO abductions that had been going around for a long time, but she and I had not heard those. Well, maybe we saw the Betty and Barney Hill movie on TV, but for the most part, we thought of UFOs in a Close Encounters of the Third Kind sense. We were amazed and excited by them, but felt that they were our wiser space brothers. We didn't feel that we had a reason to be afraid of them. And in fact, we often talked about how we would love to make first contact, and we'd love to get to ride on a flying saucer, and all that sort of stuff. So, when we saw that light, we both grabbed our flashlights and took off into the woods, trying to bring ourselves closer to our space alien brethren. Why we jumped to the UFO conclusion, I can't say. If we had interpreted it as a ghost, I'm sure we would not have chased after it. But we had UFOs on the brain, and so off we went into the darkness. Every time I hear people talking about lights in the forest at night, it seems that they can never get any closer to it. That was not our experience. We caught up with the light in very little time. We could see it clearly, a glowing ball that seemed to be a kind of a liquid, living light. Not like a structure, but just a light that floated. We followed it, but it always kept a few trees in front of us, leading us onward. The light, which would turn blue, then yellow, then red, then orange, then green, moved behind a very tall and thick old tree. and was momentarily out of our sight. We began running around the base of the tree, and on the other side, instead of a floating ball of light, we were met by the most horrific-looking creature that you could possibly imagine. There was a drooling, hairy, 8-foot-tall giant waiting for us there. I mean to say that it was bent forward, and yet still 8 feet tall. If it were capable of standing fully upright, therefore, it would have been much taller. Its hands reached out for us, and each hand was about the size of our crotch area up to our heads. That's how massive they were. But they weren't just giant hands. They had retractable cat-like claws that shot out when it reached for us. The drooling, disgusting-looking head on the thing was like a sick dog that had seen better days. Do you know that eye gunk that some dogs get? This had that gobbed on as though it had been piling up for years. It looked like Alice Cooper's tears painted on the sick old dogman's face. Its ears had tears cut out of them, evidence of a lifetime of violence. The dog chin had a beard hanging from it that reminded me of a goat's beard. The eyes did not glow as in modern Dogman stories, but they were bloodshot instead. The Dogman growled and shouted at us, not sounding like barking, but instead like some sort of a language. Pat said that to her it sounded like a dog shouting in German, if you can imagine such a thing. I agree that it sounded like a language, maybe some dog version of Klingonese or something. We ran back in the direction of our campsite, and the big old monster man followed us, complaining loudly the entire way back. I could hear him not only breaking off branches that were in his way, but knocking entire trees over, the smaller and younger ones, that is. When we re-entered the clearing, I no longer could hear it at all behind us. It was like there were a cone of silence placed over the campsite. We both climbed into our tent without putting out our campfire, which is a no-no. We were both too scared to extinguish the light that the flames provided, because neither of us wanted to sit in the dark. We couldn't sleep anyway, so we sat there, listening, waiting for the dogman to come get us. He never did, and we survived the night. But Pat dumped me soon after that. She told me outright that she would never have seen that werewolf thing if it hadn't been for me, and that, therefore, we were no good for each other. I argued that we had helped each other get through the experience, and that proved that we belonged together, but she wanted nothing more to do with the supernatural. She told me she wanted a guy who didn't believe in ghosts and monsters, that she wanted to worry about normal things, like kids and jobs and mortgages. She knew that life with me was going to be too scary a proposition, and so even though she admitted she loved me, she felt she had to leave. As it turns out, I never had another odd experience in my entire life. No ghosts, no aliens, no Bigfoot, and I never again saw anything like the Dogman. But who knows if that might have been different if we had stayed together. Maybe Pat was right in a sense. Maybe the combination of the two of us really was some sort of supernatural magnet. I don't know. And I never will know. It's as though someone or something else decided both of our fates for us on the night when we saw the ball of light and the Dogman. Don't go anywhere. We've got not one but two more supernatural Dogman stories coming up in this episode. But right now, I'm gonna drop a rhyme about today's executive producer, Judith Almasi. We thank Judith Almasi, a member of our posse. This show's produced by Judith, with whom we colluded. Please join us in thanking Judith Almasi for making this episode possible. In return, we share our secret Sunday uncensored stories far too wild to ever run on this channel, not to mention our 15 hours of archived, scary, uncensored stories. You can become a Scary Stories executive producer like Judith Almasi by joining our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or by clicking the join link under this or any of our videos and becoming a Scary Stories channel member. PQ Ribber will be back at the end of this episode to explain it all in greater detail. But now it's time to jump to our second of 3 supernatural Dogman stories for today. And we call this one The Shadow Casting Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I used to live in a really creepy house near Pittsburgh that had a reputation of being haunted even before we moved in. We sort of expected to see the shades and darting figures that we encountered in there. We were braced for that from the start, but none of us had expected that living in that house would mean having encounters with a very real-seeming, very physically real creature or entity that in modern times has come to be referred to as Dogman. I had a figure that would wake me up at night in my bedroom. I took it to be a man at first because I could see its shadow on the corner of the room, and it stood up tall and on 2 legs. I don't know if this was the Shadow Man that I hear people talking about, but I guess it might have been. The thing is, I don't think that the shadow I was seeing was the creature itself. I think that was its shadow, and that it was actually standing closer to me but remaining invisible. As the invisible creature who somehow cast a shadow became more familiar with me, an odor of wet dog would accompany its appearances. Sometimes the smell remained the next morning, and even my mother could smell it when she came to wake me up for breakfast and school. She made me clean my room twice as much as she made my sister do hers, because she thought that somehow it was me making that wet dog odor. Mom and I would shampoo the carpeting in that room together, and then the smell would just come back anyway. She had the carpet torn up, and then she and I cleaned and waxed the hardwood floor that remained. Still, the odor would return after each visit from the invisible creature who somehow cast a shadow. The thing would sometimes come and sit on the end of my bed, or even come up right near my face at night. It breathed like an animal. It sounded like it had asthma. I didn't tell my sister about it because she would make fun of me, and I didn't tell my parents about it because I knew we couldn't afford to move. I didn't want to be a bigger burden on them than I already was. They had to feed and clothe me and so forth, and I didn't want them worrying about me on top of it. It was my personal hell that this entity, which I had begun to think of as a demon beast, would enter my room at night. I even had a mental image of the thing as some kind of a demonic wolf creature. Well, one night, my sister and my mother drove into town to go shopping for girl supplies, and when they got back and parked the car in the driveway, they ran into the house, screaming. When my father and I asked them what was happening, they both claimed that when they got out of the car in the driveway, a giant dog, walking on its hind legs like the Frankenstein monster, had burst out of the bushes and charged at them. They said it had teeth like something from 1,000,000 years BC, and that it smelled worse than my bedroom. I asked if it had tall ears pointing up on top of its head, and they asked me how I knew that. I said I was just asking, but really, that was how the shadow looked in my room at night. The shadow looked sort of like the Batman from the Tim Burton movies, with tall pointed ears up on top of its head. I asked them to tell me every detail of what the thing looked like as my father searched the grounds and came back empty-handed. I felt more prepared for what was haunting me in my bedroom from then on, now that I had a description of what this thing actually looked like. It didn't matter, though, as the shadow-casting behemoth never visited me again. At least, it never woke me up again. We lived there another 4 or 5 years, in which time my sister saw an old man staring in her window at night, but never staring at her. She said it looked like the man from the movie Carnival of Souls. My father would see what appeared to be a black cat racing into and out of rooms. My mother would see a man in military apparel from the World War I era and a teenage girl in a bright blue 1940s style house dress walking past doorways suddenly and silently without any warning. When she would run out into the hallway, of course, there was never anybody there. I myself thought I felt presences several times after that, particularly in the kitchen, but I never saw anything odd again after my visitation stopped happening from the shadow-casting Dogman. Dogman is a harbinger of bad times. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I think I may have seen a Dogman one time in my early teenage years. In fact, I know I saw something, and I know it looked like a Dogman, but the context of the sighting was so bizarre that I'm not sure if it's the same Dogman you and other YouTube channels talk about so much these days. This Dogman seemed to appear to me to warn me or to inform me of my grandmother's passing on. It's a short anecdote, so I'll tell it to you complete, and maybe you or your listeners can explain to me what actually happened. I was so close to my father's mother that my dad used to mock me for it. He had never gotten along that well with her and told me that she used to be a strict disciplinarian. With me, on the other hand, she was kind and generous and thoughtful. She showered me with presents and took time to explain things to me that no other adult would explain. She treated me like I was important and special, and that drove my father crazy. "Why couldn't you have ever bought gifts from me?" he would ask her in fury. "You didn't even bring me gifts on my birthday. You told me I needed to learn to be tough, and you did need to be tough," I remember her shouting back, "so that you could be the father to my precious grandson." This made sense to her, but not to Dad, who grew jealous of me and would do all sorts of passive-aggressive things to get back. He had tried so hard to earn his mother's love while I did nothing and was showered with praise and affection. Looking back on it, I kind of feel bad for my father, but at the time, I just understood that he didn't like me, while my grandmother did. When I was around 13, Grandma became noticeably weaker in every way. My visits to her were less frequent and tended to be shorter. I hadn't really connected to the idea that her time on Earth might be drawing to a close, but I knew that life seemed to be getting harder and darker in general. With Grandma around less, my father could get away with being more spiteful to me than before. I started to develop a stomach condition that led to extreme abdominal pain. My father laughed at me and told me it was only happening because I was so weak. When I was 19, I was actually diagnosed with an ulcer, but when I was 13 and 14, I believed my father that it was only happening due to my own weakness. This would make me unsure of myself and more stressed out than before, and then of course the pains would return, and I would be unable to do my homework and uninterested in life. But that kind of thing was only beginning to happen when my Dogman encounter occurred. I was fishing with my friend Roger at a creek located about a half-mile from my family's home. I was having a good day, maybe the last good day of my young life. I suddenly had a fierce stomachache out of nowhere, one caused by stress. I looked around, wondering why I was feeling that way. I usually only had an ache that bad if my father were throwing a temper tantrum or punishing me, yet here it was happening while I was having a relaxing day of fishing. I knew something or someone was causing this, as an angry person walking near me in those days would be enough to set off my stomach alarm. If you're a materialist, you might not understand what I'm about to say, but I was hypersensitive to negative energy entering my electrical field, or whatever kind of field it is that surrounds us. My nervous system seemed to be based in my belly, and so I would get stomach cramps that initially no doctor could find a cause for. Later, they told me it was the early stages of the ulcer forming, and that's what caused the pain. But the ulcer was a symptom. It was a result, not a cause. Western medicine, at least in those days, was not open to seeing things that way, but I knew what I was saying because I had the direct experience of it that they did not have. So I looked around for a while, and then I saw it. There was a man standing in the bushes, watching me and Roger. But it was not a normal kind of a man. It was some sort of savage man, but not a caveman. And it was not a Sasquatch. Those look either like a primitive human or an evolved ape, but this thing appeared to be purely supernatural. It was a man, but a man with a dog's head. And when he saw me looking at him, he walked a step or two out of the bushes so that I could see him, from the tips of his dog ears on top of his head, down to around where his navel might be if he were actually human. He was covered in a grayish fur that looked very much like the fur of wolves I had seen at the zoo. It had shoulders like a man, though. When I tell the story these days, people laugh and say that I saw a furry. But this was the late 1960s. I really don't think it was a furry because the face looked so natural, and costuming was not that advanced in those days. I've seen furries with panting tongues and semi-realistic eyes from the 21st century, but even movie monsters made by professionals back then did not look that realistic. This was something supernatural, and my friend Roger saw it too. While I was staring at the Dogman, his eyes connected with mine, and I knew at once that my grandmother had passed away. I knew it was a serious message, and that this was a messenger, and I knew she was gone. Somehow I knew all those things right at once. Roger noticed the Dogman somewhere in the middle of my experience with the creature, and he at once began shouting at it to go away. "Go away, monster!" That's what he called it, a monster, and he began throwing small rocks at the creature in an attempt to scare him off. As though in response to Roger's complaining, the creature, never breaking eye contact with me, walked backward 2 or 3 steps until we suddenly couldn't see him any longer. Roger said we should go get bigger rocks and chase the creature down, but I told him I had to go because my grandma had passed on. He didn't understand, but I left anyway. I went home and my mother was there, crying. She told me to sit down and that she had bad news. I told her what the news was before she could tell me, and then we both sat there, hugging and crying. Mom and I had never known the mean, disciplinarian version of Grandma that my father had always complained about. We had lost a close friend and ally, someone who had some control over my father when he lost his temper. Without her, we both knew that Dad was the unquestioned master of both of our lives from that day forward, and that he would become the disciplinarian that he had suffered through in his own childhood. As my teenage years pressed on, I became rebellious naturally, as all healthy teens do. There was an unhealthy undercurrent in the family by that point that led both me and my father to go too far on several occasions, tearing our family apart. It took me years of therapy and meditation to begin to pull my life together again. And somehow, I was warned that all this was about to happen because Dogman is a harbinger of bad times. Welcome to the Dogman Show, starring me, your old pal Bigfoot. This is not a format change or anything really. It's just that I call it the Dogman Show when I'm talking to my friends. Like, I don't have time to play today, I have to write the Dogman Show and stuff like that. Generally, I really don't know if the stories we tell are actually true or not. I know it is a big deal to a lot of you, but there are very few Dogman stories that have even the slightest bit of validation. I'm sort of a skeptic. I'm more inclined to disbelieve than to believe. This little tidbit I want to toss out first, though. Now this, I know for a fact, is true. Many of you probably already know about this since it's been a big deal for a while now. But there is a real, actual, 100% true upright walking canine who you can follow on Instagram and Facebook and I think TikTok as well. He's named Dexter the dog, and he taught himself how to walk on his hind legs after he lost one of his front arms in a traffic accident. Here's some video I shot off the screen from an article in Dodo magazine. I'm claiming fair use on this, and I hope that's cool with everyone involved. Do you see how fast he's able to run down the street? The thing this proves to me is that it's not that impossible for something like a dogman to actually exist. I mean, an animal that's canine and at least sometimes bipedal or upright could exist in the wild. I would think it could happen through ordinary survival of the fittest means. There are advantages to having greater height. This is why meerkats stand up on their hind legs to get a better view around their environment. It also frees up the front arms to use for defense or possibly carrying something. I used to know a girl who told me that she taught her dog to walk upright, and then he figured out how to steal her food from the fridge and the microwave. So, for some who say such a thing is impossible, I would have to say the evidence is not on their side. Today we've got 2 new dogman or upright walking canid stories for you. The first one, if true, is I think about a real animal existing in the wild who can walk upright like a human. The second one seems to be about something far more mysterious. A creature that seems to be far closer to a human, or at least a werewolf, than it is to Dexter the dog. But that story comes later. First, I'd like to open with this all-new story I call Dogman Ate My Garbage. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is a story from my young adulthood when I used to sometimes do jobs for a guy that lived in Dickerson, Maryland. Dickerson is a fairly well-settled place, and would seem to be an odd location to see such a rare cryptid as a dogman. But I swear to you that not only did I see one, but I saw one eating my own garbage. Like I said, Dickerson is hardly a wilderness area. It's sort of suburban mostly, with some elements of urban thrown in. While that's true, it's also pretty close to Sugarloaf Mountain, the Mono KC Natural Resource Management Area, and other patches of forest here and there. To me, looking at it on a map, it doesn't look like enough wilderness to support a creature like the mythical Dogman. But then again, what I saw was not a werewolf type of Dogman. This was more your classic Linda Godfrey Michigan Dogman type creature. It didn't have hands, it had paws, and had a torso more canine than human. I'll give you a better description when I get to that part of the story. So, one day I went over to my boss's place in Dickerson to find out what my work was going to be for the day. I knew I was going to have to pick up and deliver some product for him, and I brought a friend of mine with me to ride shotgun. The boss was busy, so he gave us some petty cash and told us to go get ourselves some lunch while he got his end of things together. My buddy and I bought ourselves a fast food treat, and we proceeded to eat it in the van. When we were done, we drove back to the boss's house in Dickerson and went to throw our trash out in his garbage cans on the side of his property. We both had trouble figuring out how to open these plastic garbage cans he had, and after we threw our stuff out, we didn't seal the lid properly. We were young and stupid, and we didn't have animals getting into our garbage where we lived, I guess, so we carelessly left the lid slightly open. That must be how the dogman or whatever it was smelled our food in the first place. So we were back inside the house talking to the boss, who had an old paper map laid out on the table telling us where we needed to drive first, second, and third. While we had this conversation, we all heard a bit of a fuss going on outside by the cans. Walking over to the window, my boss started cursing that a bear was in his garbage. He ran outside, which my buddy and I thought was crazy. We huddled by the window like little chickens, watching the thing tip over the can and start eating what was left of our fast food lunch. The creature was on all fours once the trash got tipped over, and it was scavenging what it could find. I thought that if that was a bear, it was the thinnest bear I'd ever seen. My buddy pointed out that this dark creature had hair too short to be a bear and had ears too long to be one too. At that moment, our boss came into view from that window, and he was jumping up and down, making a lot of noise and waving his arms over his head. Obviously, he thought this would frighten the creature off. Instead, whatever it was stood up and basically roared. It sure looked to me like a dogman, but it sounded like nothing I'd ever heard. I mean, it was not barking, it was bellowing. Our boss turned right around and ran back away from it, and that dog-like beast ran after him, still on its hind legs. I quickly opened the front door to let my boss in. His face was redder than I'd ever seen it. As soon as he was inside, I looked behind him, and I saw that dog-headed bipedal monster had me in its view now. It was running right at me, baring its teeth, and looking like it was ready to terminate me without prejudice. I got that door shut and locked, and the three of us watched the door shake and rattle and almost buckle as the creature furiously tried to get inside and at us. I tell you, in that moment, we three were living inside a real-life horror movie. I remind you, this occurred in the middle of the day, in bright sunlight. The creature eventually stopped, and we were too scared to go look where it went to. Our boss screamed at us that we were so stupid we didn't even know how to lock a garbage can. There was nothing we could say in return. He was right. We had been pretty dumb. We almost got him killed by being so stupid, and we just took his dressing down silently. When I tell this story in person, people often tell me that what we encountered was a bear with mange. I admit that bears with mange do tend to look more like a large dog than a healthy bear would. The problem with that kind of a debunking, though, is that this creature did not appear to be ill in any way. It ran quite well on its hind legs, and when have you ever heard of even a healthy bear doing that? Bears can sort of shuffle along on their back legs, but if they need to run, they drop down to all fours to do so. I think we saw a dogman. It looked like a dog, including dog paws and dog ears, but it walked on its hind legs. What else could it have been, except an upright walking canid or dogman? I tell you, since then, I am an expert at locking garbage cans. I make sure all food garbage is disposed of in a way that wild animals cannot get at. And that's all because of the time that Dogman ate my garbage. Don't go anywhere. We've got a story of a supernatural-seeming dogman in a second. But first, I'd like to give a shout-out to our executive producer for today, Cheryl from Boston. Our thanks goes out to dear Cheryl. She likes Dogman, who is feral. Whenever we feel lost in, we think of Cheryl, who's from Boston. Please join us in thanking Cheryl from Boston for making this episode of the Dogman Show possible. In exchange, she gets to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories, as well as our over 15 hours of uncensored stories available nowhere else. You can see them too by either signing up to our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else by clicking the join link below to become a channel member. PQ Ribber will be along at the end of the show to explain further, but now it's time for our second Dogman story of the day. This one seems to be far more inexplicable than the first one, as you can tell right from the title, which is I Saw a Werewolf Who Was Not There. Dear Scary Stories NYC, here's a story for you of a dogman-like entity that seemed to be supernatural or supernormal in some manner. I don't know if it came from another reality, from under the ground, from outer space, or what, but I know for a fact that it was actually there. Well, I'm fairly sure it was actually there, and practically certain that I am not losing my mind. This happened about the year 2003 when my wife and I rented a house in the woods outside of a small town called Pot Liquor Flats in Pennsylvania. Both of us were ahead of the curve on the whole working from home thing, as we were both freelance artists working over the internet. Since we realized it didn't matter where we lived, we decided we'd rather live in nature than in a city. Trust me, we're back to living in a city now, in an apartment building, with plenty of people around us, and zero dogmen. But back then, we thought nature was our friend, and so we walked right onto the turf of this apparently supernatural, or else highly advanced, dogman or werewolf creature. I had to learn to drive in order to live out in the country, a skill that is superfluous when you live in the city. Since driving was new to me at the time, I found myself extra conscious of my surroundings. I would notice things my wife did not, and on one evening when she and I were coming back from a supermarket run, I saw the dogman for the first time. It was ahead of us on the right, standing between two trees on the side of the road. I pointed him out to my wife, who looked to her side, then looked behind us, telling me she only saw some trees. She didn't act like she disbelieved me exactly at the time, but by breakfast the next morning, she was mocking me for seeing imaginary werewolves. Let me tell you exactly what I saw, even though I only saw it for an instant. It was between two trees, as I said, with one hand on each side holding onto one of the trees. It appeared to be a very tall individual, in fact, alarmingly tall. It looked like a bouncer in a club, muscular and threatening without even having to do anything. Its eyes glowed white, which seemed to indicate that it must not be human. Only animals have eyes shine like that, so I thought at the time that it was a bear. Bears do not have gray fur, however, and bears are not built like this guy was. It was a giant, hairy, gray man with a dog-like head. Time passed, and then one morning, I awoke before dawn and before my wife as well. As I poured myself a bowl of cereal in the still darkened kitchen, I saw something that caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. Turning to look, I saw that same giant man that I had seen on the highway. This surprised me so much that I dropped my cereal bowl and spoon loudly. It was a shock at first and I was startled, but the more I looked at the thing and the more it looked at me, the more my body became gripped with a really existential kind of dread. I mean, the existence of that thing was completely spoiling my morning, and the idea that it knew where I lived caused me to turn cold all over and to shiver. The creature was standing partially behind a tree, but it was clearly there and staring at me just like the first time. It reminded me of depictions of Bigfoot in that it was partially concealing itself but also making me aware of its presence at the same moment, and the way it stood so still and stared deep into me, well, that was entirely unnerving. I received a second startling surprise when my wife rushed up behind me, asking me if I were all right. I think I jumped higher when she touched me gently on my shoulder than I had when I realized I was being stared at by some kind of a monster man that isn't supposed to exist. Immediately I pointed her out to where the man was, but of course, he was no longer there by that point. My wife looked at me like she was really concerned and said something like, "This isn't that werewolf creature again, is it, honey?" She really thought I was losing my mind, or maybe I had lost it already. I began to suggest that we should move out of that place, but my wife loved the house, and she basically told me to put on my big boy pants and learn to deal with it. I saw the creature randomly for the next few months, and I only told my wife about it if she was standing right next to me. I tried to get her to see it, but it would never be there by the time she looked. When I would see it alone, I wouldn't bother letting her know about the incident, as I knew it would only lead to more of her telling me that I needed a shrink. One time I was driving and I saw it along the highway again. I pointed it out to my wife in plenty of time for her to see it, but she just kept staring at her phone and said something like, "That's nice, dear." She wasn't even trying to see it. She was convinced that the dogman was not actually there. I began to have more self-doubt than I had ever had before. I was pretty certain that I was seeing something real, but I was living with a person who thought I was hallucinating. I began to question my eyes, and I began to question my judgment. I was beginning to wonder if I was bats in the belfry, and I went from alpha straight to beta in the process. My wife became the decision maker when we used to share those duties. She began to treat me like a child, and I either raged against it or accepted it, depending on how much I was questioning my own sanity on that particular day. One day, her brother, my brother-in-law, was at our house, and we were chilling on folding chairs in the backyard together. My wife went inside the house for something, and then I saw the dogman walk right out into the open from behind a tree. That was the first time I could clearly see that the legs he stood on were built differently than a human's legs, and that they far more closely resembled a dog's back legs. I nudged my brother-in-law, who was preoccupied by placing his drink on the ground next to his chair. This time, I never took my eyes off of the dogman because if it split before he could look up and see it, this time I wanted to see where it split too. Well, my heart sank as that dogman seemed to get a grin on his fang-filled face, and then he melted out of existence in front of my eyes. My wife's brother was asking me why I nudged him, but my mouth was hanging open in total confusion and surprise. That thing wasn't running away before other people could see it. That thing was disappearing from view. It might have still been standing in that exact spot for all I knew. At that point, I think I had what they used to call a nervous breakdown back in the 20th century. I began weeping and confessing the entire story to this guy that I was only related to by marriage. I told him that I had lost my mind, and I kept thinking I was seeing a werewolf, and that the werewolf was staring back at me. At first, my wife's brother agreed with me that it did sound like I had become paranoid and delusional, possibly even schizophrenic. But soon, he left me to my weepy, sobby emotional collapse. He got up and walked over to where he had seen me looking. "Hey," he called out to me shortly thereafter. "Is this where you saw the creature?" he asked, pointing to a spot on the grass. I said yes, and he proceeded to tell me what direction the creature was facing when I saw him. Again, he was correct. Soon, my wife had joined us, and my brother-in-law proceeded to tell both of us where I had seen the dogman walk from, and to, and where it had disappeared. I asked him how he knew all this, and I angrily accused him of playing with my head. Rather than answer in words, he motioned us to both approach and to come see what he was seeing. There, on the mud and grass in the back of our yard by the forest, were the largest dog tracks I'd ever seen. They exited the woods, walked out in front of where I'd been sitting, and then the tracks ended. They just ended. My wife looked like all the blood had been drained out of her. My brother-in-law knew more about strange occurrences and high weirdness than we did at the time. He told us that he didn't know what I was seeing, but whatever it was, it had nothing good in mind for either of us. This thing was at least trying to drive me insane, and possibly its plans were far worse than that. My wife joined me in looking for a new place to live. I at first was looking to rent houses in more crowded areas, but she insisted we move back into a city apartment. This way we could sell the car and save money, as well as ensuring that the dogman or werewolf or whatever it was would never get close enough to stare at me ever again. Although it's clear that my wife now does believe that I did see what I saw, she doesn't want me to talk about it. She told me she'd divorce me if I became one of those people who wrote a book about a monster, then went on Coast to Coast AM and all that stuff. She has also banned me from bringing up the subject with her unless I actually have a new sighting. Since something like that seems unlikely to happen in our current urban setting, I expect and hope that I will never again have reason to cry out, "I saw a werewolf who was not there." The Beast of Brandywine Falls, or the Waterfall Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when most people think of Ohio, they think of places like Cleveland and Akron. Maybe the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame pops into their mind, or all the great legends of rock music that are from here. Alan Freed, the Cleveland disc jockey who popularized the term rock and roll itself, and encouraged both black and white kids to listen to the same kind of music for probably the first time in our culture. Screamin' Jay Hawkins, arguably the first horror-oriented rock star, was from Cleveland, as well as punk-era acts such as Devo and the Cramps. The great horror host Ghoulardi, aka Ernie Anderson, was from Ohio, and he went on to be the voice of ABC television in the 70s and 80s with his catchphrases, "Roots," and "The Love Boat." The Cleveland area has gotten an image of being one of the coolest places on the planet for both music and monster or horror culture. But in actuality, the Dead Boys wrote the song "Ain't Nothin' to Do" about Cleveland and Akron. Of course, there's a lot to do around here if your idea of nightlife is camping under the stars. There's some of the most beautiful nature in the entire world in these parts. Situated right south of Cleveland and north of Akron is the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And to the west of that, you can visit multiple nature preserves like the Hinckley Reservation, the Mill Stream Run Reservation, and the Brecksville Reservation. As busy and bustling as our cities and suburbs can be, that's just how wild our natural areas are, and they are everywhere. With untamed wilderness often comes stories of cryptids as well, and Ohio has its share of those. We don't just have Bigfoot sightings in these parts, we have multiple different kinds of Bigfoot, each with their own name. There's the Ohio Grassman, a very long-haired kind of Sasquatch. Then, of course, we have the Cedar Bog Monster, a kind of Bigfoot named after the nature preserve it's been sighted inside of. We can't forget the very famous Minerva Monster, which also seems to be a Sasquatch. Besides that, there's the Mill Lake Monster, the 11-foot tall beast known as Orange Eyes, the Crosswick Monster, the Lake Erie Monster, the Peninsula Python, and of course, the famous Loveland Frog or Frogman. Ohio is one of the monster capitals of the Midwest, heck, of the entire United States. So it should come as no surprise that we have Dogman here too. At least, on the day I'm gonna tell you about, we certainly had one here. My friend Joel and I know for a fact that there is a large, allegedly mythological predator here, because we saw it for ourselves. It was not a Bigfoot though, that's for sure. It was a canine, and I'm gonna go ahead and call it a Dogman. I'll tell you all about it, but let me start at the beginning. Located on the eastern edge of the wild areas just outside of civilization exists a little waterfall and swimming hole so lovely that you half expect Mr. Rourke and Tattoo from Fantasy Island to come out and greet you. It's got a number of wooden observation areas so that you can observe it and feel its cooling mist on your face during a hot summer day. But you can also dive in and swim in the water at the bottom. It's called Brandywine Falls, and it's fed by the Brandywine Creek, by the Brandywine Trail, the Brandywine Picnic Area, and even the Brandywine Inn if you're looking to stay overnight. My buddy Joel and I decided to stay there for a 3-day weekend at the end of July back in the early 2000s, but we wanted to rough it, so we found ourselves an out-of-the-way place to camp. 3 days of heaven was our plan. For the most part, that's what we got, but we also got a little bit of hell thrown in when we came face to face with an actual, real-life Dogman. The two of us knew that camping is kosher in the Cuyahoga Valley, but we weren't sure what the boundaries of that are or were. At one point, we were going to ask, but we figured we might not like the answer, so we just decided to find as secluded a spot as we could, as close to the waterfall as possible. If we got kicked out, hopefully there wouldn't be a fine if we left quickly enough. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was our plan, and we were happy with it. The first night was beautiful and uneventful, and we had a ton of fun. We built a fire pit, cooked weenies, roasted marshmallows, told scary stories, got wasted, and passed out. In other words, the perfect night of camping if you're a young man like we were at the time. When we awoke the second day, the sun beat down on us through the humid air and we roasted ourselves like we were the weenies. It was acting like it was gonna rain, but it didn't. And it was like the entire area was a sauna. Still, we were young and unafraid of sweating, so we had a fun day, hanging out in the shade close to the falls to mitigate the oppressive heat. After dinner, we both decided to sneak back to the falls and take a dip to cool off before bedtime. I cooled off faster than Joel, who was more heavyset than I was at the time, although since the recent pandemic I have caught up and surpassed him in that department. I walked back to our camp to dry off and put on some music playing quietly when I got back there. After some time, I thought I heard someone shouting for help. I wasn't sure if it was real or my imagination, so I turned the music off and I listened. After a little while, I heard something that might have been a shout, or might have been a bird or an animal. It was coming from the direction of the waterfall, so I decided to jog on over there just to see what I could see. As I came around a big tree, Joel ran smack into me, knocking me back on my butt. Dust flew up in the air and got all over my sweaty body. I had the wind knocked out of me briefly, but when I recovered, I was laughing and coughing at the same time. It seemed funny to me, but I didn't hear Joel laughing along. In fact, I couldn't see Joel at all. Then, I looked behind and I saw him still running. In fact, running frantically, and in the direction of our campsite. That set off an alarm bell in my head, but I was in such a relaxed mood after spending 36 hours or more in quiet, peaceful nature that I didn't run after him. Instead, I thought about going to take another dip in the waterfall pool to get the dirt off my back. Looking back on it, I can't believe I wanted to walk toward what my buddy was running from. It was one of the dumber decisions of my life up to that point. As I strolled toward the waterfall, I heard a sound that was really familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Then, my overly relaxed synapses made the connection. That was a much deeper and more feral version of the sound that my childhood dog Sandy the Golden Retriever would make when I would try to take her stuffed rabbit toy away from her. She would grip it in her teeth, and I would pull, and she would go all feral, but it was a game for her and me. This snarling that I was hearing sounded as serious as gunfire, and I stopped walking to look around in the darkness and locate the origin of it. Then, there it was, the reason for this story. Standing right there in front of me was this man that looked like he was wearing a really expensive monster makeup by Tom Savini or Rick Baker. I don't know if you've ever seen old 80s monster flicks, but they sometimes had great-looking monsters in them, and this looked like one of those. I stared in disbelief, and to be honest, I studied it, trying to understand how the effect was being achieved. I saw the face change expression from angry to angrier, and I assumed they had to be using hydraulic puppetry on the face. How else could it look so realistic? But if they were doing it that way, there would need to be cables coming out of the face mask or costume at some point, and I could clearly see that there was no such thing. My next guess was that somehow these effects were being produced remotely, by some kind of radio-controlled device. After all, there might have been technological improvements since the last time I read Fangoria magazine, which was years earlier when I was a kid. I was staring at a man taller than me, and I was just under 6 feet tall. He was wearing a costume, or so I thought, that caused him to appear as though he were covered all over with fur like a dog or a wolf. The head was just like that of a dog, except its tongue did not hang out panting, the way a dog's tongue naturally does. This seemed to be a more intelligent kind of canine, and it stood up like a man, so it had to be a monster makeup. I could see the actor's huge muscles move under the fur, and I got my first shiver of fear at that moment. If this guy attacked me, he would ruin his fancy makeup. But also, if he attacked me, he would easily win the battle. If he was sane, then I was fine. But what sane man stands around on a super hot summer night in the woods in Ohio wearing an expensive and very professional-looking werewolf costume? The dogman-looking guy began to slowly crouch, as though he were preparing to leap onto me, and as he did so, he bared his truly impressive dentures at me. Whoever created those was a very talented professional, because they looked just like the teeth of a predatory monster should look. They were even stained in a realistic fashion, as though they had chewed on living things for over a decade as a matter of course. While the actor growled at me through those chompers, drool literally poured out of the sides of his mouth. His mouth was watering. He was staring at me, and his mouth was watering, as though I looked appetizing to him. It was somewhere around this point when I finally understood that this was not an actor. This was not a Hollywood makeup job. This was not a monster creation by John Caglione or Ed French. This was some kind of a real-life living beast, and it was staring at me as though I were its prey. I watched its eyes become completely dilated, and I understood that this creature was seeing far more than we humans can ever see. I understood that he was the hunter, and I was the hunted. I began backing away, and the creature growled but did not advance toward me. I kept slowly, steadily, putting more distance between us in the most casual way I could manage. My face was blushing, which seemed odd to me then, and still does. It was like I was embarrassed that I was about to be torn apart and devoured, but I guess I really was. Embarrassed, I mean. After all, I had every warning possible when my friend Joel ran into me, and I walked into this trap anyway. At some point, I decided I had put enough distance between us, and I turned and ran, heading toward our tent. My only hope was that the beast did not know which way our tent was, and I was going to have to use that to my advantage. I faked left once, faked right 2 different times. I took a shortcut over some rocks, which would have hurt my feet if I were able to feel anything in that moment, except deep and total, complete fear. I made it to what I thought was my tent, but when I got inside, Joel was there, weeping and screaming at me to zip it up. As I did so, I saw the dogman running headlong toward me, barking and screaming like nothing I'd ever heard before. Joel and I huddled inside there listening to the loudest barking possible. It hurt my ears, and I felt like I was being punched with sound. I fully expected to hear the tent being ripped apart, but that didn't happen. We got barked at for some time, and then it grew quiet. Neither of us had the nerve to look outside, and neither of us put out our campfire. I figured if the tent started burning or the forest around us, then we'd have to deal with it then. We had built a good fire pit surrounded with stones, and we were going to have to hope the fire died out on its own. Plus, It was possible that the fire was the reason the dogman had not come any closer to us. Maybe it was the only thing keeping us alive we didn't know. That was the most pathetic night of my life, as my buddy and I wept like babies, convinced we were both goners. We were too ashamed to even make eye contact with each other. We had both failed as men, or at least that's what it felt like to us. All our macho and bravado had been torn away, and the only good part of it was that none of the girls we hung out with had seen our sorry display. The next morning, Joel told me that he had been in the pool cooling himself off, standing partially under the waterfall and using it as nature's shower. It was the most peaceful moment of his life, and then, suddenly, he heard someone wading up behind him. The noise under the water could get quite loud, so he didn't hear the individual approaching until they were right behind him. That was when he noticed the extreme wet dog smell, and he turned around to look directly into the mouth of that dogman, which was right at his eye level. Joel said he didn't remember anything else until he ran into me on the way back to the tent, which was quite painful for him. He remembered limping the rest of the way back to the tent, and he remembered going into a kind of state of shock or something like that for a while after. Maybe he's lucky to have parts of his memory blanked out, as there would be very little good in him remembering much more than what he did. We both packed up and left a day early, feeling fully defeated. We tried to make lame jokes about how that dogman was really a park ranger evicting us from our illegal camping site, but neither of us had the energy to laugh about it. He and I remain buddies to this day, but he moved to the West Coast and I moved to the East Coast. We remember each other's birthdays and send greetings on holidays and all that sort of thing, but we haven't seen each other very much since that night of camping. Maybe that's how it would have developed for us anyway, since it's hard to stay friends with people after you grow up and begin your adult life in earnest. Or perhaps our friendship was terminated by the angry creature we now know as the Beast of Brandywine Falls, or the Waterfall Werewolf. Don't go anywhere, we've got another all-new allegedly true Ohio dogman story coming up in a second, but first, last episode I credited Sharon Smirnoff as our executive producer, but for some reason on screen I listed her as Sarah. I have no idea where that came from, and I'd like to apologize and give her a makeup credit right now. Thanks, Ms. Smirnoff. First name's Sharon. Apparently, my brain is barren. I must have pulled that name right out of a hat, and you deserve far better than that. Please join us in thanking Sharon Smirnoff for making this episode possible. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer, just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or click that join link under this video. You then gain access to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories, and depending on what level you join at, you may get to see our archive of something like 17 hours of secret uncensored tales, or even get to see our shows in advance of the general public whenever possible. Coming soon, we will honor Braden Russell and our newest channel member, 0718 Dragon Lord, and we'll see how I mess up their names. Now, on to our second Ohio dogman story of this episode. Located only about a half-hour's drive to the southwest of Brandywine Falls is a little town called Windfall, Ohio. Windfall is a fun place to visit. It's got a variety of fast food joints, a fishing pond, and even a dinosaur amusement park. But at least on this one day in question, Windfall was home to an upright walking canine who we will refer to as the Windfall Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a brief dogman story to tell you that took place in Windfall, Ohio. I worked there at one of the fast food places, I won't say which. One day, I got off my job earlier than usual and I jogged over to Jurassic Mountain. I know, and I knew at the time, that it was a place mainly for kids and families, whereas I was a 20-year-old lone wolf, but I had not yet seen their life-size moving T-Rex, and I'm a huge dinosaur fan. It's a nice enough exhibit, but I allowed my imagination to take me away and pretend it was real. What would it be like to have a real T-Rex walking down Medina Road, which is the main road of Windfall? I imagined the T-Rex walking out to the nice little enclaves of houses, terrifying the parents and amazing the kids. I know it's dumb, and my parents tell me it's a waste of my time, but I love dinosaurs, and I can't help but imagine them being still alive. I don't suppose we humans could coexist with giant carnivores trotting around, but I can't help being fascinated by the idea of it. Afterward, I wandered out into the park they have over there behind Jurassic Mountain, the one with the fishing pond in it. It was getting dark, but I wasn't ready to go home and do my chores. I wanted to sit on the grass and imagine some more. What would it be like if a T-Rex poked his head up over those trees in the distance? Imagine seeing a bunch of brontosaurus heads at the ends of those long necks, sticking up over the trees, eating the soft leaves up at the top. Wouldn't that be incredible? Some people dream of a vacation on the beach in Hawaii, but I dream of seeing prehistoric monsters in real life. And then, my dream became real, only it wasn't as fantastic and fascinating as I had always expected it to be. There, in the early evening darkness, right in front of my eyes, this sneaky-looking creepy animal man sort of lurked out from behind some trees. It was like as if Wile E. Coyote from the old Roadrunner cartoons had come to life. He looked evil. He looked like a villain in a very exaggerated manner. I swear he kept looking left and right as if he were guilty of something or trying to get away with some misbehavior of some kind. He sort of hunched over and looked like he was tiptoeing. He had emerged from one patch of trees and was heading toward another patch. The upright Dogman was probably as far away from me as home plate is to second base, but he looked to be about the height of a reasonably tall man. Not 7 feet, but probably 6 feet, I guess. He was very skinny, but still athletic looking. His paws had long fingers for a dog, although they would be stubby and short on a human being. Even at that distance and in the darkening dusk, I could tell that his claws were long and sharp, much longer than any dog I ever knew personally. I was thinking about grabbing my phone to take a picture when he saw me. He had been looking left and right in that guilty manner of his, and then our eyes met, and it was a shocking moment for us both. Up until that second, his eyes appeared dark to me, but when they met mine, they seemed to light up a bright, hypnotizing white, almost as if they were glowing from within. When he looked at me, he froze, mid-step. I couldn't tell if he was going to run away in fear, or if he was going to charge me next, but I didn't stick around waiting to find out. I booked it out of there, too scared to look behind me. That was the single scariest moment of my life. When I told my friends about it later, they all wanted to see the Dogman too. They talked me into going back on 2 different nights, and we sat in the spot I had been sitting that day, waiting for him to put in an appearance. I think there were 5 or 6 of us the first time, and 3 or 4 of us the next time, but I never saw that Dogman again. To be honest, I was relieved both times when someone suggested we give up and go somewhere else to do something more normal. Even though my friends were all hyped up to see the Dogman, I was scared spitless and hoping he wouldn't show up. Although I still to this day enjoy going to hang out in that town, I never again want to lay eyes on the Windfall werewolf. Dogman. and the Flying Demon. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've seen a number of strange cryptids and unknown creatures, but I saw them all during one crazy summer when I was 14 years old and my sister was 18. Since then, my life has been incredibly boring. At the time, my mother was convinced that the problem centered around our use of the Ouija board, but we just laughed at her. How could something mass manufactured by Parker Brothers be summoning demons and poltergeists, and even this creature that I guess must have been a dogman? Nevertheless, once the board was disposed of, we did stop seeing the strange things we'd been plagued by all summer, so maybe our old fogey of a mom was actually correct? During that summer, our mother's half-sister, who was a full 10 or 11 years younger than her, and from her mom's second marriage, came to stay with us. She was in her late 30s, while Mom, who had had both of us fairly late in life, was pushing 50 by then. Aunt Ida would call Mom old and out of touch behind her back, and she would enable our misbehavior and then cover for us. We loved to hang with her, and she seemed so much more fun than our parents. But looking back on it, she was also kind of a little bit of a troublemaker. One bit of trouble that I can sort of trace back to her was her encouragement in terms of us using the Ouija board. Before Aunt Ida came to stay, we almost never played with the Ouija board for one simple reason. It didn't do anything. We'd sit there with our fingertips on the planchette and ask questions, but none of them were ever answered. When Aunt Ida got excited seeing it in the closet underneath Monopoly in the Game of Life, we groaned. She said it was her favorite game, but we told her our Ouija board seemed to be broken. Nevertheless, when she pulled it out and set it up, my sister Dora sat across from her and I watched. No sooner had Aunt Ida asked a question than the planchette began moving around, spelling out strange words I was unfamiliar with. We both assumed Ida was making it happen, and at first we called cheater on her. She acted innocent and insisted she wasn't doing anything. Then she suggested I take her place across from Dora. When I sat down, the planchette continued to answer any question asked. So then I began looking at Dora, wondering if she was the one who was cheating. Somehow, all of this was incredibly entertaining to Aunt Ida, who laughed hysterically at almost every answer. Between the two Ouija sessions, we were told that there was a man living in our house with us named Bulal, or Bulal. He had never been alive, he said. He had always been a spirit being. He said he was older than the house, but he moved in when it was built around the turn of the last century. According to Bulal, spirits like him seek shelter same as living creatures do, and for similar reasons. That part made no sense to me at the time, and really it still doesn't. I suppose either Bulal was lying, or else I just don't understand what he meant when he called himself a spirit being in the first place. We asked Bulal if he was a protector spirit or an evil one, and he took a long time before answering no. No to which question we asked, and once again he just answered no. We asked him if he was protective of the house, and very quickly the planchette moved to yes. So he wasn't protective of us, but he was very protective of the house we lived in. Ida asked what he protected the house from, and he answered by spelling out the word tonight. That made no sense to me. How could he protect us from tonight? Ida asked if he meant that we would find the answer tonight, and he said yes. She asked when, and he answered 9:43, which we interpreted as 9:43 p.m. I was losing interest in the conversation at that point, but if I had known that Bulal was referencing us seeing an actual dogman, I probably would have been paying much closer attention. In fact, we all sort of forgot about the Ouija session as the day wore on, and that night, Ida and Dora were both in my bedroom, telling spooky stories under the blanket with me. Suddenly there was a loud thumping noise, and we scrambled out from under the covers to see what happened. This football helmet I had that my father gave me was on the floor, on the opposite side of the room from the shelf we kept it on. I'm not sure how it got there, but it was the only thing we could find that was out of place. I had that weird feeling that I was being watched, and in my peripheral vision I saw something moving outside my bedroom window. "What was that?" I asked, pointing toward the window as the figure moved to the left out of my sight. Ida and Dora, both standing closer and at a different angle to the window, screamed at the same time. I remember looking at the clock and it was just a little bit before 9:45. "What?" I asked. What? Wanting to know why they screamed, but they both had such looks of terror on their faces that I was truly afraid of what their answers might be. Instead of saying anything, they turned me around and marched me upstairs with them to sleep in the guest room with Aunt Ida on the pull-out bed. They didn't want to tell me what they saw, and it would take days before I learned that they had seen a dog-headed man backing away from my window. My sister and my aunt got into an argument with both of my parents, arguing that it was unsafe for me to be sleeping on the ground floor anymore. Needless to say, I was interested in this argument, and I eavesdropped as well as I could. I didn't hear enough to understand the crux of the argument, but I suspected that it must have had something to do with that figure that I had seen briefly outside the window. My mother ranted about them spreading superstitious nonsense, and my father said he wanted to raise me to become a man, not a frightened little mouse. Dora and Ida lost the argument, but they quietly told me that if I got scared in my room at night for any reason, I should come upstairs to the guest bedroom. That night, my mother drew the curtains shut over my windows in my room and told me not to think about what might be outside, to only close my eyes and get to sleep. Of course, once she left the room, all I could think about was what was outside the window. After all, maybe what had been outside was one of the things that Bulal was protecting us from. Protecting the house from. I was filled with curiosity. What could my sister and aunt have seen that caused them to both scream out like that? In the middle of the night that night, I heard a voice talking to me in my ear. I thought it was Aunt Ida, and I told her I was too tired, I was sleeping. That was when I opened my eyes and I saw that there was nobody in the room with me at all. Getting up and looking around, I could swear I was still hearing the voice, and it still seemed to be calling out my name. Against my mother's wishes, I pulled open the curtains, and that was when I saw it. The single most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Imagine a kind of big black dog that had rolled in mud and feces for years and never got a bath. Then imagine it standing up and glaring at you from outside your own bedroom window. It was standing right there, like it had been waiting for me to open those curtains. Just like it was reading my mind. Just like it, well, to be honest, just like it was the one who had been in my room whispering my name. I ran upstairs as quickly and quietly as I could, and I slept on the rug in the guest room. I was too afraid to pull out the second bed. I didn't want to wake my parents and start up that argument again. I slept lightly, and in the morning, I ran back downstairs to my bedroom once the sun was up. I didn't want my mother or my father to catch me in that guest bedroom. That day, I got Ida and Dora, pulled them aside and told them what I saw. They admitted that was the same thing they had seen moving away from my window. The same thing they hadn't wanted to tell me about for risk of scaring me too much. We pulled out the Ouija board again, and this time we asked Bulal if that smelly-looking dog-headed hairy caveman thing was what it was guarding the house from. The planchette moved in little circles and didn't answer. We tried asking it again in different ways, but we couldn't get an answer. Then, finally, Ida asked if that dogman was one of the things Bulal was protecting the house from, and we got a very quick and emphatic yes. That Ouija board seemed to completely open the floodgates. Each night after that, we saw something different outside the window of the guest bedroom as we hung out there before bedtime. We didn't even bother telling scary stories any longer. We could just watch scary things out the window instead. One night we saw these things hanging from the trees out back that we could not identify. We watched objects fly across the room and crash into the opposite wall. We kept losing things, only to have them turn up in places that we couldn't possibly have put them. And at night, every single night for 4 nights straight, we either saw that dog-headed caveman, or we heard truly frightening things outside. We heard howling that would set off all the dogs in the neighborhood. We heard snarling sounds coming from some place we couldn't locate. We heard scratching sounds coming from the basement during dinner one night. Through all of this, the 3 of us avoided my parents, who seemed to be in a constant bad mood. Whatever we did, they had some kind of harsh judgment about it. Nothing we did was right. It reached the point where Dora and I were saying bad things about them behind their backs to Ida. In honesty, Aunt Ida had started all this, but I think she felt bad and regretted her statements and actions from when she first came to stay. As a peacemaking measure, she went out one day and came back with a ton of food, saying she was going to make a big barbecue for the entire family that weekend. Her idea was to get us all together outside, having fun, and talking as a family again. I'm not sure what caused her change of heart, but it seemed she was sincere, and we all loved barbecue, so finally, that weekend, Mom, Dad, Dora, and I all enjoyed this massive barbecue celebration together, thanks to our Aunt Ida. As the night came on, we weren't even scared to be out there any longer, and we had been living a fear-based life up until that point. It was as though, with one act of kindness, all the harshness and horror of that summer were being eradicated by Aunt Ida. And then, my mother pointed up in the sky and asked, "What's that?" We all looked up in the darkening sky and saw something flying up there with bat-like wings. It couldn't have been a bat, though, because it was not flapping its wings to fly as bats do. They flap furiously, a fact I know because we had plenty of them in the neighborhood, and they usually did come out at around that time in the evening when day turns to night. This thing, whatever it was, simply glided, with its wings outstretched to its sides like a hawk or other raptor bird would do. It appeared to be riding on air currents very high in the sky. The other part of that realization that was disturbing was, if that flying creature was high enough in the sky to be gliding that way, it had to be very high off the ground. That also meant it had to be much larger than we had first thought it was. Too large to be any bat that's supposed to live in the United States. Probably too big to be a flying fox, too. Why the hell would someone be flying a kite this time of night? Asked my father, who then gasped as the kite flapped its wings one single time. It was almost as though it had heard my father and wanted to prove to him that it was in fact very alive. Aunt Ida nervously asked me and Dora to help her clean up. She said it was time to go back inside. We did as she asked, and I remember hearing a strange sound coming from the woods behind the yard. It made my skin crawl long before I was able to identify the sound and consciously understand that I was hearing something growling. My father seemed to hear the sound too. He had a curious look on his face, and he was moving, slowly, step by step, towards those woods. He obviously was trying to suss out what could be generating a sound like that, since we were in a suburbs next to a woodland not known for any large predators at all. Ida walked over to Dad, telling him just ignore it and head inside, a notion that he rejected in a very annoyed fashion. He wasn't going to be told how to behave on his own property by a half-sister of his wife. He probably should have listened to her, though, because his approaching those woods angered the growling man-thing inside there. Moving forward out of the tree cover was that dog-headed monstrous thing again. It seemed much larger than it had before, and I had not noticed its muscular shoulders and arms. It was like a Frankenstein monster of a dog, walking on its hind legs, like a werewolf. I felt sick as I watched my dad's knees buckle, almost causing him to fall down on the spot. He caught himself and backed off toward the house. Mom screamed, as did Dora, and I remember plates and cutlery crashing to the ground as there was a stampede to get back inside the shelter of our home. Only Ida and I remained there for a few moments longer, staring at each other, and then back at the dog-headed thing, as a buzzing noise from over the treetops drew our attention away from the bipedal canine. There, flitting and zipping in a way much like a giant housefly, was a man-sized creature that at first I thought was a living helicopter. This flying nightmare had a proboscis instead of a mouth. A long and tubular protuberance emanated from under two large, alien-looking eyeballs. It had segmented eyes that appeared to be able to see in multiple directions, yet it also had long antennae that felt around as though it were blind and in darkness. It had bat-like wings, but not the large ones we had seen on the hawk-like bat earlier. These little bat wings appeared too small to lift this entity, which flitted around like a hummingbird nonetheless. It had back legs that looked like goat legs, but with thick, long feelers, or ultra-thick hair-like extensions. In front, it had what looked like 4 insect or spider legs. This was neither insect nor mammal, but instead a product of the bad dreams of both. The hideous impossibility landed on the back of the dogman, who flailed about, trying to get the monstrosity off of it. It looked the size of a cat relative to the dogman, like a cat had jumped on the upright canine's massively wide shoulders. I saw the thing stick its proboscis in and begin sucking out the life fluid of the big, hairy non-man. It was like a demon, but it was like a mosquito, too. A giant mosquito from hell, or perhaps a vampiric flying demon. There was an increasing buzzing noise making the insides of my ears tickle, and Aunt Ida grabbed me. She pulled me toward the house as I saw them. 5 or 6 or 8 more of the blood-hungry demons emerging, buzzing over the tree cover. How many might there be? Were we about to be swarmed by man-sized, blood-sucking, demonic vampires that buzzed through the air on tiny bat wings? We ran inside to find my mother demanding to know where we kept the Ouija board. When we didn't answer fast enough, she charged into my bedroom and began throwing the contents of my closet out onto the floor. When she found the Ouija board box, she had first tried to smash it, but she hadn't the strength to break a board with her bare hands. Frustrated, Mom shouted at Dad to start a fire in the fireplace. "In the middle of summer?" he asked. Mom had lost patience, so she pushed past him and grabbed the couple of logs still sitting there from the winter and threw them inside the fireplace. Wait, let me open the flue," said Dad, realizing his wife meant business. "You don't want to set off the fire alarms," he told her. From the look on Mom's face, setting off fire alarms was the least of her concerns. None of us wanted to see that Ouija board burn, but none of us was going to say a word about it under the circumstances. It smelled awful burning, but it made Mom feel better. We all slept upstairs that night and for the next few nights as well. Eventually, it dawned on us that all the activity had ceased. Whatever doorway we had opened with the Ouija had been closed again by my mother. Or else, maybe all those things were still outside, still where they had always been, but maybe our ability to see them, to hear them, had been stripped away from us by the destruction of the Ouija board. Aunt Ida left soon after, and I still keep in touch with her. My parents never invited her back for any reason, not even for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I still talk to her over the internet, though, and we send each other our little movie reviews that we write for our friends. Once in a while, we get to talking on the phone, and it seems that each summer, we get back to going over what happened that one very strange summer. Neither of us have ever had any experience like that ever again. The only cryptid sightings either one of us ever had all occurred within that 6-week period of my youth. Those crazy nights that all culminated when we witnessed with our own eyes the battle between Dogman and the flying demon. Some people be lovin', some people be hatin', some people be great, such as Mr. Braden. Some people be scrawny, some people got muscle, like our executive producer named Braden Russell. Please join us in thanking Braden Russell for making this episode possible. Is Dogman driving me crazy? Dear Scary Stories NYC, why does Dogman sometimes seem interlocked with other strange phenomena of an apparently psychic or paranormal nature? Is the Dogman a natural animal that attracts the strange to it? Or is it itself something that we might think of as supernatural or supernormal? I've got a story to tell you that happened to me personally, which causes me to ask these questions. And no, even after my experience, I don't have any answers. If you do, then please listen to my story and you can tell me what's going on, because I really don't know. Everything bad in my life started when I saw a Dogman. I didn't see the thing on my property, at least not the first time. I saw it in the backyard of my boss's summer home, located in upstate New York. Although I also live in the suburbs, I live in a cheaper place far closer to the city. In fact, my area is so suburban that I felt safe from ever seeing any kind of cryptid there. My sense of security was ill-founded, but I'll get to that part when I get to it. So, going back to where this all began, my wife Andrea and I were attending a summer party which, as I've said, was at my boss's house. Those were annual affairs before COVID, and although they were not technically mandatory to attend, we all knew we'd better show up, and we better act happy about it. There were plenty of spirits and libations being served, but I stayed absolutely sober so that I could drive myself and my pregnant wife back home when it eventually came time to leave. That's why I can state with complete certainty that I was not under the influence of anything except meat, bread, cheese, and fruit drinks when I saw the Dogman for the first time. The party had moved inside because a thunderstorm was off in the distance, threatening to erupt over our heads at any second. I don't think it ever did reach us, but the lightning and thunder was close enough to elicit oohs and ahs from the assembled partygoers each time another one crashed down to earth. Most of the guests were in the front of the house, where large picture windows afforded a better view of the natural fireworks off in the distance. My wife and I found ourselves in the back of the house, talking to a friend of mine from work who disliked crowds and noise as much as Andrea and I do. I was telling him a story about my days as a minor league baseball player when I noticed him staring past me instead of at me. I figured I was being boring. Maybe I had already told him that story before or something like that. I was about to change the subject when my work friend pointed over my shoulder and out the back window. I turned around to see what he was pointing at as he asked, "What the hell is that?" My wife and I moved closer to the window to see what he was talking about. There was eye shine coming from the woods. It was pretty bright, and it was hard not to notice it, but it was impossible to tell what the eyes belonged to. They were looking in our direction, that much was for sure. I asked if anyone had binoculars, a question I could already guess the answer to, which was no. I wanted to get a closer look at whatever that was out there. "I've got something better than binoculars," came the reply from my wife. She had noticed a few light switches labeled outside lights. Flipping them all on at once, the entire backyard, from side to side, was illuminated with brilliant white light, turning the dark, stormy day into a bright, sunny one in a single blinding instant. We could immediately see something none of us were expecting to see. That was not a deer out there looking at us, nor was it a raccoon or an owl. There, just inside the now completely visible tree line, was a kind of creature that is not supposed to even exist. It was a hairy, movie monster like Bigfoot, but the body shape precluded it being a human in a costume. The legs were not shaped like ours. They were shaped in an evil way, as though they belonged to the devil himself. This non-man was covered in hair like a dirty old bear, but its head was angular and fierce, with long, pointed ears on top, almost as long as those on a rabbit or a hare. It was not a bear or a rabbit, though. It was something far more like a dog. If that wasn't a dogman, then it might have been a werewolf. It glared at us and screamed something, sounding like a woman in pain. It was not a bark, and not a howl. That was a scream. Silently, I turned all the light switches back into the off position, and the three of us quietly left the back of the house. Suddenly, we wanted to be surrounded by a crowd of people. Somehow, being left alone had lost its charm for the moment. I can't speak for the others, but I had an oddly guilty feeling, as though I had done something wrong just by noticing that monster. None of the three of us mentioned it to anyone else there. We just tried to get involved in mundane conversations about weather or whatever in order to try to quickly forget what we had seen. Later on, my wife and I drove home silently. We only spoke when we had to, and neither of us had anything to say about anything that had happened at the party. When we were getting into bed that night, I tried to bring up the creature that we'd seen earlier, but my wife stopped me. "If you talk about it," she told me, "it will hear you. It will come back if you even think about it." I was so surprised by what she was saying that I literally had no response whatsoever. It sounded like she knew what it was. Why had she decided that it knew my thoughts? Why did she think that talking about it would make the creature pursue me? That night, I dreamed about nothing but the Dogman, with my wife in the dream urging me to stop thinking about it. The more I tried not to think about it, the more I would think about it. I don't suppose I have that much control over my thoughts, and so the Dogman was in every dream all night. I woke up, still thinking about him. That night, my wife and I both heard a howling coming from outside. I sat up immediately, thinking that had to be the Dogman. But then, I remembered that the Dogman we had seen had screamed like a woman. He hadn't howled. That idea did not completely calm me down, however, and I started thinking about the Dogman even more intensely. Soon, my wife and I began doubting our sanity as our personal items continually ended up being misplaced. I found my keys in the freezer, and my wife found the clothes she had put in the dryer back in the washing machine she had taken them out of. There were multiple occasions where I thought I heard her calling my name, only to find her on the opposite end of the house, or even outside. One time, I woke up after 3 a.m. to find her missing from bed. I searched the house. I checked to see that both cars were in the garage. Then I returned to our bedroom to look for my cell phone so I could contact the police. But she was right there in bed, sleeping like a baby. On another night, we had friends over to play poker. When one player ran out of chips and said he was bowing out of the game, suddenly, a chip fell onto the table right in front of him from somewhere up above. We all laughed, asking who had done that. Nobody was willing to take credit, and then another chip fell from above, hitting our friend on the top of the head before rolling onto the table in front of him. That time, we all knew it was not one of us doing it, and nobody was laughing anymore. It seemed to drop out of the ceiling, but everything looked perfectly normal up there. That ended the game for all of us, as nobody wanted to even be in that room any longer. Our friends started visiting us less and less as the strange occurrences ramped up. My wife was going to have a baby soon, and our lives were only becoming more stressful by the day. She began to look around for another place for us to move to, and I soon joined her in the effort. We would need to sell this place first, though, and for some reason, that has turned out to be a problem. As far as I know, the story I'm telling you has not leaked out, so it's not that people think it's haunted or being stalked by the Dogman. It just seems to be extremely bad luck. In fact, we've been having a lot of bad luck since we saw that Dogman. It's occupied my mind every single waking moment since it happened, and I needed desperately to talk to my wife Andrea about it. Her insistence that we avoid speaking or even thinking about it was just impossible for me, so I begged her to work with me on at least coming up with a code system to discuss what was happening. "It's the devil," she responded to me. "It's the devil doing this to us." So instead of calling it the Dogman, we call it the devil now? This has caused me to see it as the devil too. I'm not sure how that makes anything better. To me, it makes things far worse. It feels like we're giving that thing even more power over us than it had before. One night, I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, and as I was doing my business, I heard someone whispering my name from inside that very room. I jumped up. I made a mess, and I slipped and fell. I could also feel whatever that was laughing at me. The Dogman is not just an animal, it's something more powerful than that, and it abuses its power. It laughs at the misfortune of those it has attached itself to. When my wife had her baby, she insisted on staying in a hotel for 2 weeks. She was afraid of bringing that baby home to our house. We really could not afford to have her do this, but she insisted that we couldn't afford not to. Our baby is very precious to us, obviously, and there's no way we would allow that devil Dogman to harm her if we can in any way prevent it. And then came the day when I was at work on my laptop at home just after the beginning of the COVID era, and my wife was taking a shower in her hotel room. When she got out of the shower, she could hear the baby crying, but she could not locate where the baby was. Eventually, Andrea opened the hotel door and found our daughter lying on the carpet in the hallway. She rescued her, then immediately called down to the front desk, demanding to know who had done this to her baby. They insisted that no one was in her room at all during that time as far as they knew. The cleaning staff were working on the floor beneath her, and nobody with access could possibly have been there. After calming down a bit, Andrea remembered she had put the chain lock on the door. She always did that by force of habit. Whoever broke in must have also broken the chain on the door. All she had to do was prove that, and she would be proving her case that there had been a hotel room invasion. When Andrea walked to the door to examine it, however, the chain lock was locked in place. It was not damaged in the slightest way. In fact, after bringing the baby back in, she had locked it into place herself automatically without even thinking. In my opinion, there is only one answer to how this could have happened. The devil, or the Dogman, is in some way attached to both Andrea and myself. It doesn't matter where we go, it'll follow us. I felt we had to do something to get the creature to leave us alone. First, we called in a Catholic priest who prayed and sprinkled holy water around. He had a very blasé attitude and didn't seem to be putting too much stock into what I or my wife told him. And then he smugly told us that he was sure we would be fine as he prepared to leave. At that moment, he was interrupted by the loud sound of something big, howling, directly in front of that house. We looked out the windows but could find nothing there. The priest was now visibly shaken and seemed frightened at the idea of heading out front to get into his Volvo. He stared around himself in horror the entire time. I didn't actually laugh at him though, because it was clear that the dogman was still in our lives and still very much in charge. We called in a ghost hunting team who got nothing at all, not one single shred of evidence. They told us our place was not haunted. The night after they left in failure, I had the following dogman experience. We have a 2-car garage, but it is not connected to the house. After you park your car, you exit through a side door and then walk down a path to the house. The path is usually lit at night by small lights we've installed alongside of it that work on a timer system. That night, the lights were off. I looked toward the house and saw that all the lights in there were out as well. This alarmed me because my wife and child should have been inside there. I wondered if we were experiencing a blackout. Allowing the garage door to slam shut behind me, I immediately heard a snarling kind of sound, the noise a feral dog makes when it's very angry. I turned around to see a 6.5-foot tall dog-headed Bigfoot, essentially, standing just behind me. It could not have been there. I had been holding the door open and then let it slam. If it had been there then, I could not have been holding the door open. They couldn't occupy the same space. I ran through the darkness, tripping twice and falling once. I heard the thing growling and snarling. I felt its presence close behind me in the darkness, and yet it never grabbed me. It never stopped me. Surely it would have had multiple chances to with me hobbled by darkness. I was screaming in absolute terror. I was running, sliding, crawling away from it as fast as I could. But that huge beast could have finished me off or picked me up and run off with me if it wanted to, any time at all. How did I reach the house unscathed? Why did it let me get away? And that's another thing. When I opened the door to the house, everything was lit up. There was no blackout. All the lights were on as always. Why could I not see that from outside? What kind of head games does this thing play? How is it able to make me think one thing is happening when in fact something completely different is really happening? Or have I reached the point in this story where I would be wiser to doubt my own senses? Is it possible I should begin to doubt my own sanity as well? Our daughter is a toddler now, and she still seems to be fine as far as we can tell. My wife and I still have strange things happen to us, but our child so far has only been targeted that one time in the hotel. We're concerned about her when she reaches the age soon for having imaginary friends. We need to get rid of this attachment before that happens. We already know that moving out probably won't help after what happened in the hotel. We've spoken to some people who claim to be able to rid your home of demons, but they tell us that the Dogman sightings are unrelated and a different matter altogether. We can't accept that, and have yet to find a group or individual who seems willing to accept our version of things before coming into our home. We continue to look, but we are not going to work with people who think they can tell us what's happening on our own home when they've never even been here before. It seems that almost everyone has their own worldview and opinions about what is happening to us, and none of them are willing to listen to us and look at things with an open mind. They're all projecting the beliefs and baggage that they brought with them. They aren't considering that maybe this story might be presenting a new paradigm. I'm not saying we're special. I'm saying maybe this situation is. My boss called me into his office last week, and starting this week, I'm on an extended leave of absence. He thinks it's stress from COVID that's wearing me down. He has no idea, as far as I know, about what has actually been going on. Is it possible that the Dogman might be driving me over the edge? Is it something that has ever happened before? I've been unable to find any case histories that seem to match ours, and so I'm not clear as to what our options are or what we should be doing. I'm going to lose my job permanently if I'm not in a better situation before the end of this leave of absence. I'm going to have to be able to prove to the shrink my company employs that I'm A-OK and ready to get back to my job before I'll be able to go back to being the breadwinner. The future of my family depends on me being okay, but I'm convinced I'm being stalked and harassed by a dogman who is sometimes invisible. Even as I type those words, I know how crazy that sounds. My wife says that if I'm able to wonder whether I'm sane, then I must still be sane. I'm not sure it's as simple as all that. A sane man would have found a solution to this by now. I feel weakened, and I also feel that this thing is feeding off of my fear and uncertainty. That might explain why it let me get away from it that night that I ran from the garage to the house. Maybe it eats fear, and so it doesn't actually need to eat me. Maybe that's the only reason I'm still alive. But maybe that's also the reason I'm on leave of absence from my job. I don't know what to do, and I'm at the end of my rope. No psychiatrist or psychologist can help me as long as that dogman is still attached to me. My only hope for sanity is to make the thing go away. For the sake of my family, what should I do next? Because I'm honestly beginning to wonder out loud. Is Dogman driving me crazy? Some people love cables, some folks cut the cord. Our executive producer is 0718 Dragon Lord. Please join us in thanking 0718 Dragon Lord for making this episode possible. Now, here's PQ Ribber as Dr. Death to explain how you too can become a Scary Stories executive producer and gain access to some cool perks. Doctor?
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. If you have a scary experience you want to tell us about, you can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.